Good afternoon, everybody. This is the joint meeting with the Board of Commissioners and the Civil Service Commission. The date is Wednesday, October 25th at 3:30 p.m. City Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
This roll call is for the Board of Commissioners. Mayor Rostack,
Present.
Vice Mayor Kerr,
Here.
Commissioner Taglerini, Commissioner McGeehan,
Here.
Commissioner Brooks. Here. The next roll call is for Civil Service Commission. Chair Embler. Here. Vice Chair Ponte, she's absent. Commissioner Contrail,
Here.
Commissioner Tilka,
Here.
and Commissioner McLaughlin. Present.
All right, thank you. Next up is public comment for anything that is not on the agenda. Do we have any public comment at this time? Okay, public comment is closed. First item up are discussion items, number 4, letter A. At the September 13th, 2023 Civil Service Commission meeting, they voted to approach the Board of Commissioners for the Civil Service Commission to be able to have the ability to reinstate an employee wrongfully terminated. The motion carried 2-1, and this is the first discussion item.
Thank you, Mayor. As chair, I would just like to thank everybody for coming together. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss two issues that we voted on as a Civil Service Commission that would be what I view a drastic change on how we've operated in the past. We had numerous discussions amongst us, and in fact, we are not unanimous in how we feel about these two issues. So in order to, we hope, save time, rather than us draft it, then bring it to you and back and forth, we thought it would be beneficial to get together to see where you folks are philosophically on these two issues. In just a moment, I'm going to ask Jerry Cantrell to go through a PowerPoint presentation to go through the details of it. But in a nutshell, the two issues are, first of all, do we change the authority of the Civil Service Commission? We have jokingly called it, give the Civil Service Commission more teeth. In the past, we've always been viewed as an advisory board, but there is a view that the Civil Service Commission should have more authority as it relates to running the city. And Jerry's going to go through that in just a moment. The second issue is, who should the Civil Service Commission have the ability to work with? In the past, it's always been the people who are, let's say, protected civil service workers, and it's under discussion as to whether that should be also include directors, who in the past have not been included. So those are the two issues that we have had a lot of discussion, and we finally said we would love to get philosophically where you folks feel about those two things, and we're thrilled to have our past representatives come in to give us an historical perspective. So with that, unless there are questions, I'd like to turn it over to Jerry Cantrell. He's got a PowerPoint to go
Chairman
through.
Embler, I do have one question.
Yes.
Do you mean, by directors, do you mean department head?
A good question. It would be the people directly reporting to the city manager.
Okay, so that should be the department heads then?
Department heads.
Okay, all right,
Correct.
thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Yes. Okay.
Is it okay? All right. Thank you guys for your time. Hopefully, does everybody have a packet? I'm making sure that's close enough. Does everybody have a packet? Okay. All right. Let me bring this up. I'm not going to try to let's see. So I want to tell everybody I'm going to read this as it is. So please know there's not a lot of fluff in here, and if anybody wants to interject, please stop me. I have no problem with stopping and to address things. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the Civil Service Commission meeting where we voted to approach you, the Board of Commissioners, and ask for guidance of whether the Civil Service Commission should be able to have the ability to reinstate an employee if they have been wrongfully terminated. All right. In review of the personnel policies and procedures, as well as considering past issues, the Civil Service Commission discovered that there is a need for a process to reinstate an employee that is wrongfully terminated. Attorney Eschenfelder informed the Civil Service Commission that there is currently no method for the Board of Commissioners or the Civil Service Commission to require the city manager to reinstate wrongfully terminated employees. If it is determined that an employee is wrongfully terminated, should the CSE request that the Board of Commissioners to act on a reinstatement or the employee, or should the CSE directly act themselves? Attorney Ashenfelder recommended the Civil Service Commission be the body to make this decision if it happens. All right. Going back to August 20th of 2018, there was a joint Civil Service Commission and a Charter Review Committee at the time. Both committees agreed that the Civil Service Board needed to have more power to make decisions, especially when it comes to grievances and appeals. And then there was also mentioned in there that arbitration steps needed to be put in place and that all employees should have a due process in the event if the employee was terminated. Moving on from there, September 10th, 2018, there was a CSE meeting regarding employee resignation versus termination. This was Miranda, I believe, BOC patent. There was a determination to begin investigation of potential wrongful termination of Miranda, right? Chair Rasmussen on the 14th of September, this was at the grievance hearing itself, asked why the city should take the word of an ex-disgruntled employee, and the city was too quick and suggested witnesses be subpoenaed for that meeting to move forward. Linda Hine, and I honestly don't know who Linda Hine is or was, I have no idea, all right? She had concerns on how an employee can be reinstated after being terminated. These issues were actually brought up later in meetings. I didn't bring a lot into that because it doesn't tell me what the outcome of that was, all right? On October 29th, 2018, at a Civil Service Commission, Mr. Hendricks mentioned during Personnel Policy Review that he wanted to see grievance in the charter because the Civil Service Commission could make determinations on their own. Chair Rasmussen felt that there was a conflict of interest in the grievance process because the city manager was directly involved in the termination of Miranda, all right? The chair also stated that having the grievance under the Civil Service Commission would provide it more teeth, all right? That more teeth keeps coming up a lot. November 16th, 2018, there was a grievance hearing for Miranda. The city manager and leadership in the city did not follow them. They found that the city manager and leadership in the city did not follow the employee policy and procedures and that the city had wrongfully terminated Miranda. The city manager at the time did not act on the Civil Service Commission's advice and did not take the information forward to the Board of Commissioners. All right. By December 10th, 2018, all right, the Civil Service Commission had not received a response from the city manager regarding this advice. I think they were supposed to receive something by like November 30th of that year, and it did not occur. Vice Chair Hendricks at that time of the Civil Service Commission stated that he had reached out to the city manager on multiple occasions and received no response. It was stated that if the board had more teeth, this could save the city from going to court. All right. Doug Andrews in that meeting, I think it was as a public speaker, all right, clarified that Miranda wanted to clear her name and be reinstated. The issue for Miranda had taken months, and the issue had gone on for too long. That was Doug Andrews that said that. And Doug Andrews expressed an unfairness in how the grievance had been handled and that Miranda had no choice but to take her case to civil court. I have no idea if she took it to civil court. I don't believe the city was sued, but I can't find any paperwork on that. And I honestly researched back to 2016 on every meeting to see if I could find anything, stuff that's posted online. Let's see, I want to make sure I'm not missing anything there. Slide 10. Not, okay, all right. The CSE determined that at that point that it would go to phase 2 hearings, all right? The recommendation from the Civil Service Commission at this point was to reinstate Miranda because she was falsely terminated. She was determined to have resigned, but she didn't, and they let her go, so they terminated her. On January 22nd, 2019, at a CSE meeting, Vice Chair Hendricks discussed moving on with the Phase 2 grievance hearings, and Attorney McConnell at the time explained that the Civil Service Commission is advisory to the city manager. The city manager rejected its recommendation, the Civil Service Commission, and the decision was final at that point. Miranda was not going to be reinstated. Then we move forward from there. So this employee was never reinstated. It was found in a determination through, is it called a quasi-judicial meeting a hearing that she was falsely terminated. On July 15th, 2019, another employee, Capusta, there was a pre-termination hearing. The CSE found that the Madeira Beach leadership was not compliant with the personnel policy and procedures again. It made a recommendation to reinstate Capusta. The city manager at the time did not act on the CSE's recommendation, and Capusta was not reinstated. Capusta filed an FLSA suit and received compensation for wrongful termination from the city. We did lose money on that. All right. Then on July 20th, make sure I got my dates right, July 20th, 5 days later, Vice Mayor Andrews. So I believe at this point, make sure I didn't do anything wrong there. Were you on that last one, Mr. Hendricks? Were you on the commission at that point, or were you in the Board of Commissioners at that point? Okay, all right, okay, all right. So Vice Mayor Andrews acknowledged in BOC regular meeting and a Civil Service Commission bylaws, talking about that in July 20th of 2022. By the way, this took a long time to go from 19 to 22. And quite honestly, guys, it took years to get to this point. And the problem is that there was a series of delays. I mean, there were things like resignations, commissioners termed out. There weren't three members, so they couldn't hold a quorum. The city manager in the past had delayed the meetings for almost a year because he wanted to make sure that the new city manager was in place before we had any meetings, or that Civil Service Commission. So there were the things that happened that probably should not have happened. But it took a long time to get back through this process, all right? So at the July 20th, 22 Board of Commissioners regular meeting, Vice Mayor, Andrews, acknowledged that the problems had occurred, and I'm going to read this exactly as it is. Problems have occurred with grievance procedures, and mistakes were made that had not been corrected. The Civil Service Commission conducts grievance hearings and makes a recommendation to the city manager, a charter officer. In one case, the grievance was found in favor of the employee and against the city manager, and he ignored the recommendation by the Civil Service Commission, and the Board of Commissioners did not act upon it. I don't think it was given to the Board of Commissioners, just to clarify that, all right? The grievance hearings are time-consuming. The Civil Service Commission felt they had spent their time for nothing. They need more teeth to do their job so that this does not happen again. Continued on, city managers should not decide their own fate. If a charter officer files a complaint against an employee and the Civil Service Commission finds in favor of the employee, the complaint and recommendation should be given to the Board of Commissioners and not to the city manager. The procedures need to be changed to make that happen. He does not know if, that was Andrews, he does not know if the change must be made by the voters or by the Board of Commissioners, or if the Board of Commissioners could do it. That would change the dynamic and the direction of the Civil Service Commission. All right, at that same meeting, Mayor Hendricks at the time agreed that Vice Mayor Andrews, and supported a change giving the Civil Service Commission more teeth. He was involved in the Civil Service Commission hearing when this occurrence had happened, and he was very disappointed in how it was handled and how the employee was handled. The Civil Service Commission is an important, impartial group, and if a complaint is found against the city in a grievance hearing, they need the ability to be able to fight back. Same meeting, Mayor Hendricks said if the charter officer brings a complaint against an employee of the Civil Service Commission and an employee, and the Civil Service Commission finds in favor of the employee, then that should come before the Board of Commissioners and not to the charter officer that filed the charges. Attorney Mora thanked the mayor at this time for clarifying things that were discussed prior to that, and said that they would come up with the best procedure mechanism to make this change. I can't find anywhere, don't know if it happened, I can't find anywhere that happened. All right, just stating that. So I wrote that in there. I just can't find it. So what are we asking? All right, all that to get to this point. And this has to do with two past grievances where the city did lose money without a doubt because there was a wrongful termination. In both cases, the recommendation for the Civil Service Commission was to reinstate the employee because it was a wrongful termination. Attorney Eschenfelder informed the Civil Service Commission that there is currently no method for the Board of Commissioners or the Civil Service Commission to require the city manager to reinstate wrongfully terminated employees. That's the key thing. It can't be done, all right? If it is determined that an employee is wrongfully terminated, should the Civil Service Commission request the BOC to act on the reinstatement of that employee, or should the CSC directly act? All right? Attorney Eschenfelder recommended the civil service be the body to make the decision, and I'll allow Mr. Eschenfelder to clarify the reasons behind that, but I think it's to protect the city. So that is really the first issue, and those are the things we need to discuss. Would the three of you like to add stuff to that, please? Is there anything that I missed, overlooked, or not stated? That would be Dr. McLaughlin, Dr. Tilka, or Ms. Embler.
I think you did a thorough job. I mean, I'm really glad that this issue's before us, and I'm really impressed with your presentation, Jerry, and it is. Okay, there we go. So where was I? Yeah, I'm just overall pleased that we're going in some direction at least, and how it works out or structured, that's, maybe up to legal counsel, but we need to, I was present for both of these cases that came before us, and it really wasn't, it was a lot of tough work, and talk about, I mean, there were attorneys involved, the city attorney, the employer's attorney, the girls' attorneys and parents, and, it's just a lot of stuff that certainly could be dealt with early on. I mean, and at that point, the manager simply turned his back on the Civil Service Commission and wouldn't comply with anything, as I recall. So that's my piece. Thank you.
I just want to thank Commissioner Cantrell for putting together such a thorough presentation and bringing to light these issues, and I appreciate the commissioners for meeting with us, because clearly there's some unresolved issues that we should really address and as it relates to the Civil Service Commission. So thank you for your time, and thank you for the presentation, and I concur with these findings.
May I add one more thing? I want to clarify that we're not asking to go back and address any issue that the city manager decides on. What we're asking is specifically if in a quasi-judicial meeting or hearing, we determine as a Civil Service Commission by writing those policy and procedures that an employee was terminated in a method that does not comply with that, can we only reinstate the employee? Nothing else. We're not asking for back pay. We're not asking for any other type of compensation. We are only asking, can we reinstate the employee? Is that correct, everybody? That was my understanding.
I would like to add, I suppose I would be the dissenting voice on this. My rationale for not going down the path is as follows. Everything, I agree, that happened was tragic. We had so much turmoil going on at that time, as you heard. We had a new city manager. We had a lot of change in people. We also did not have what we all unanimously agreed to be an effective handbook and policy on how to handle grievances. Our team has been working for years on getting this right. We had a couple of hiccups of what we were going to use for the base and then make changes to, but I think that where we are now, we have a very solid draft of policies that would give the right escalation steps, and it's much clearer going forward so that I don't see us getting into this situation again. Also, personally, I philosophically believe that our leaders have to hire people with the right credentials, with the right certifications, with the right decisions to make these kinds of decisions. And that we as volunteers, I'm very comfortable with being an advisor, but as a volunteer, I would prefer to trust our city manager as well as our elected Board of Commissioners over a committee. That's my personal feelings. And this is why you're seeing two differences of opinion, and we value your thoughts and, where do you think? Attorney Eschenfelder, does it make sense? Would you like to add some of the rationale or some of your thoughts on this position?
Well, so, first of all, I apologize for being late. I was fighting traffic. Different municipalities cover this in different ways. Some have this model where the CEO can make a decision one way or the other, whether someone stays or goes, and the governing board's not involved, and there's no civil service commission. Other jurisdictions, I know I started my municipal career in the state of St. Petersburg, and they had a civil service commission which did have authority to reinstate someone who they felt that the standard was their just cause. And so the Civil Service Board, which was a 5-member board, had quasi-judicial hearings and decided. And over the years, my experience was, at times, given who was on that board, it did appear that decisions might be made for political reasons, like, I don't like the mayor, and so, I know that the mayor's administration fired this person, so I'm going to put him back to work. But, of course, many times I think they did a good job, in what they did. They usually upheld the city, and part of that is because if the city management puts together a good disciplinary case and can show that it provided, adequate due process, it shouldn't be that hard to go before a civil service board and get the matter successfully reviewed. So there's a potential for politics. There's another thing that I talked with the commissioners, the civil service commissioners, about at the last meeting that they would need to commit to, is that if the charter is changed to allow the Civil Service Commission to have teeth, if you will, to reinstate someone that it believes was terminated without just cause, they're going to have to commit to actually show up and provide a quorum, because there are jurisdictions out there that have civil service boards and people are working or whatever, and it's hard to get these volunteer citizens to come. And what we can't do, what we have to avoid, is creating what will now be a due process right that our employees have, and not being able to provide for that process. So if you're gonna do this, those who volunteer for the Civil Service Commission need to understand that if the call comes out, you're gonna have to, do something to make sure that you can come and give the employee, their day in court. The other model that's out there, and City of Clearwater has this model, they have a civil service board, which I am legal counsel to, but they have contracted with a hearing officer, and the hearing officer actually conducts the quasi-judicial hearing, hears all the witnesses, and makes written findings of fact and conclusions of law. That then goes to the Clearwater Civil Service Board, and they decide. They can't revisit the facts because those are locked in by the hearing officer. There's a transcript that they can read. But then the hearing officer's conclusions of law, was there just cause, was there not just cause, that the board can revisit that and reverse it and send it back. So that's sort of a third hybrid, that you all might take a look at. So ultimately, it's a policy decision that ultimately the city commission will have to decide, because you'd have to put the charter change out there for the voters to approve.
Please.
Terminated, why do you think it was wrongful? Was it because the city didn't follow step 1, step 2, step 3, didn't follow its own policies, or the Civil Service Commission felt the manager didn't follow her own policies, or is it because the Civil Service Commission thought she didn't deserve to be fired for what she was accused of? Was it how she was terminated or why she was terminated?
Dr. Tilka would probably be the best one to talk about this, but I can tell you from what I read, in that meeting, the hearing, they determined that the city did not follow the procedures that were set up for the policies, personnel policy and procedures. They skipped whole lot of steps. The stuff that happened with Miranda should have been handled with a counseling rather than a termination. That's what they found.
Didn't the city manager express that he thought what she did was so bad and it didn't have to go through the steps? Like, we catch you sleeping on the job, fighting on the job, doing drugs on the job,
So,
bang, you're gone.
so I'd like to interject a couple things, because I was there, so was John. But first off, all right, so can imagine the girl sitting back in the rec center, not anticipating anybody coming to her and terminating her, but the city had a personnel person then, I forget her name, it's documented, all of this, but the city manager instructed her to go back and fire the girl. And she went back and explained that she was being terminated, and the girl, I think, reacted and said, well, you know, I'm, at that point, was not going to resign, all right? And so the personnel person came back to the manager, and the manager said, well, go tell her that she would be better off resigning rather than being terminated. So she went back to her, which is, in my book, coercion, first off. Now, the issue in the first place was sort of a dark, derogatory statement about the manager, okay? And he apparently went overboard and took it too far, too soon, without consulting anyone. He thought he was going to just fire her without due process or consultation with him or anything. He didn't go there. He instructed someone else to do the work. But in the end, I think she wrote, emailed back to the city immediately saying she was not quitting. She would have to be terminated. So, and by the way, she had a totally exemplary personnel file. There were just a lot of good comments there, and she'd done a good job for the city. So I think she was just taken out myself.
So the issue that is the Civil Service Commission upset is that the city manager sent somebody else to ask her to resign or ask her to quit?
Yeah, he instructed the personnel gal, I forget her name, it's all,
And is there a prohibition of that in our policies?
no,
Or you just think that isn't right? I mean,
no.
so at the time that Miranda was terminated, did we have something that said the way an employee gets terminated is the city manager calls them in and personally does it?
No, I don't think that exists.
There was a structure. From my understanding, there was a structure, like a tiered approach of
Oh,
how you
yes, in
how you
place, but they
handle it,
didn't follow
and
it.
that tiered structure was not followed.
And what do you mean by that?
Well,
That-
if somebody is fighting, we could all hypothetically say, if somebody's fighting, there's grounds for immediate termination. You shouldn't
Correct.
start at like the lowest tier. That should jump and escalate.
Right.
But if there's a name set and somebody doesn't like it, yeah, it should probably be addressed. But does that mean the person needs to be immediately fired?
So you all don't like the reason she was terminated?
It was the process.
No,
When you read-
it sounds like it's the reason.
No, if you go
Because
back,
apparently the city manager thought whatever she called him or her or whatever was so bad that in that person's view, I don't want that employee working for me.
you have to go back and read the 400 some odd page quasi-judicial
I
hearing,
don't.
and it's actually
That's-
stated within it.
That's just it. You're saying it's the process, but it wasn't the process. You just don't think she should have been terminated for doing this one minor thing of calling a city manager some sort of a name or whatever.
Can you cite within the hearing where that problem is at? Because it's
No,
recorded in the
I'm
hearing.
I'm pulling it out of you. See,
Oh.
because
Why did they have a hearing then? Why did they have a hearing? Why did it go through that
Because
process? Why did they make
probably
that
because
decision
the
as a
employee
commission?
asked for one, right?
Miranda would have filed a grievance.
Right,
As a
so then you
commission,
have
they
to have a
decided,
hearing.
as a commission, it would have been Mr. Hendricks and whoever else was on it. I think
See, I
President
don't
Houston would have
think
made
I
that
want-
determination.
5 people from the neighborhood making a decision on why a city manager fired somebody.
Why are you saying from the neighborhood?
Because you're Madeira Beach.
Clear,
And
but
if-
when you say from the neighborhood, what are our qualifications to be on this?
Why did we get
No,
put
no, no.
here?
What I'm saying is, if this is my employee, in my mind, I'm city manager. I've got an employee who, in my mind, is bad-mouthing me and calling me names. In my mind, I think, you know what? I don't want that employee working for me. She's going to be cause strife, get other workers all worked up. I'm going to terminate her.
Did that
And
city
maybe that
manager-
person did it wrong by asking this employee, you better quit or you're going to be terminated.
Inside of the hearing, it was actually discussed that it was hearsay. It wasn't even direct word of mouth. It was hearsay.
It's what the manager believes at the time of the termination.
But if you believe it, doesn't mean it's correct. It was
But
never
I don't
addressed.
want 5 people from Madeira Beach who weren't in the workplace, who weren't at the situation. I don't want them second guessing the guy that has to work with this employee.
But you put 5 people in Madeira Beach that are part of the Civil Service Commission and wrote the policies and procedures and are familiar with that and are asked to make advisory statements already. Is it correct? Is it not? The advisory statement was that the person needed to be reinstated because it was an incorrect. It was a wrongful termination. That is clearly stated throughout that hearing.
That's
They
okay.
went through that
You can come
process.
to that decision that it was
Then who
wrongful
makes the decision
termination.
in that case?
I just
Because-
don't want that to override what my city manager has determined.
How do you protect the city from being sued then when that person takes it to civil court?
Well, the only way that person could take a wrongful termination to court is if the employee can prove that her termination was not based upon her bad-mouthing the manager, but was instead based on her age, race, religion, pregnancy, all this other stuff. There's no such thing in Florida as a general wrongful termination. The employee's got to show that I wasn't terminated for what they said I was. I was terminated because of some immutable feature about myself that is protected by law. And I only know this from private sector. I'm not sure about city employees, if they have any other versions. I mean, do they have a right to say things about their city managers and
Right, well,
that's
so,
considered free speech or something? I don't know.
yeah, in addition to the Title VII ADA stuff that you're familiar with in the private sector, because we are government, we have to follow the First Amendment as it applies to the employment setting. And so basically the balance the courts have put there is that employees don't completely relinquish their First Amendment rights by becoming public employees. They can go online, they can engage in political campaigns, but in the workplace, if what they say disrupts the workplace in some way that management can articulate, or even may disrupt the workplace, we don't have to prove it did, but that it's likely to disrupt the workplace, then under a whole host of 11th Circuit precedent, the person can be terminated. If it's a First Amendment lawsuit, it's a very fact-specific lawsuit. What exactly was said, what setting was it said in? A lot of times, what job the employee has is important. The higher up in management you are, the more disruptive what you say could be because you're part of the leadership team. If you're a part of a quasi-military organization like police or fire, where good order and discipline are important, the courts have said, that management needs the right to address what's spoken if it could be disruptive. But I think, though, we're kind of getting into this one particular employee's historical case, and I'd like to get the discussion back to looking to the future. What would this commission like in terms of its employees' ability to get their terminations overturned?
I have a question for Honorable John Hendricks. On page 15, it states, Mayor Hendricks agreed with Vice Mayor Andrews and supported a change giving the Civil Service Commission more teeth. Are you still in agreement with that? Yes or no, and why?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
And let me give a little background to this. First of all, the young lady that this happened to had an exemplary work record. It was not a problem on the job here. This was hearsay that apparently this young lady had said something derogatory, not about the city manager, but the executive assistant to the city manager. And it got back to the city manager. Now, this was off premises. In fact, it was at a bar, a noisy bar. So this was hearsay. And as Mr. Tilka will tell you, numerous times during our meetings, we tried to get the city manager to come and to answer some questions for us. He refused. Not once did he meet with the Civil Service Commission on this particular item we were going over and the hearings that we had. He was asked to come. He didn't. When we gave a decision, I understand it was wadded up and thrown in the garbage can. So if I, as a manager, fired everyone that said something about me away from the job, I wouldn't have had any employees working for me. You've got to have a thicker skin than to even worry about that. The bottom line is, are these employees doing the job here? We did have a process in place for progressive discipline. She had an exemplary record. There was nothing bad in her record at all. It was just that the city manager didn't like what was said, which was hearsay, and he terminated her. And that was it. And civil service, although we heard this case, we were completely shut down.
I'd like to ask a question. Did Miranda report directly to the city manager?
No, she reported directly to Jay Hatch.
Okay.
And Jay had never had a problem with her on anything.
So one of the things that this group has worked very hard is to better structure the disciplinary steps and processes. Before it appeared that it was everyone went directly to the city manager. Our new version that we hope you will see shortly, we have more clearly identified steps of, first it goes to the supervisor, and within X amount of days, things have to be written. The employee gets the opportunity to discuss it. There is an escalation step. So I believe that if our current handbook were in place, it would not have been as easy to have the outcome that we had with Miranda, because we've much better defined what are the grievances, and that there are multiple steps before that employee can be terminated. It was very, shall I say, loosey-goosey under the past handbook.
Mr. Mayor, could I ask a question? Commissioner Embler, just what would have happened in that case if the current process was in place? What would have happened next?
Rob, I'm going to ask you to keep me honest on this. There would have been a meeting with the employee and the direct supervisor and a response.
Sorry, that would have been Mr. Hatch, right? Not the city manager. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, just want to
And-
I want to keep the process.
I'm not familiar with Mr. Hatch, so HR should be aware and involved as an advisory person to the situation. From there, it would go up, if the employee did not agree, the employee had the right to escalate to the next level of management, who, I don't know who that would have been back at that time, or how many steps between the employee before it got to the city manager.
Two steps, unless you want to include the HR person, but right now, I believe Mr. Gomez is handling HR and his executive assistant, but really it would have only been the director and then the city manager's office. And that's I think, pretty much what was done in this case. But it was, in fact, it was brought up after that city manager felt like he wanted to do away with the Civil Service Commission and not have one at all.
So was it the immediate manager, Mr. Hatch, that recommended that Miranda be fired, and then the city manager agreed? or was it the city manager jumped over Mr. Hatch?
If we could have Mr. Hatch just kind of explain that since he's here. But it is my understanding that this was a city manager-led decision where it did not go through the progressive discipline, which is what we currently have and do utilize, just so all of you are aware. It's in the personnel procedures, the progressive discipline, which is what we use, and constantly reminding department heads, you have an employee that's not performing, you must begin to document, start with a counseling if you need, get to a verbal, eventually written, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if somebody comes in and shoots and kills the manager, I think they have my permission to terminate them, but that's a whole different issue. There are instances where they do escalate to immediate termination, such as theft, et cetera. So, Jay?
Hey, good afternoon. In that situation, I was pulled into the city manager's office and informed a decision had been made, and was, I'm trying to remember the exact, but I expressed my disagreement with it, and then went back to the office and discussed it with her, and then when Mr. Tilka talked about the whole discussion with Karen and everything, took place after that. So I was essentially removed from the decision-making process, and then when I voiced any disagreement with it, was essentially told otherwise. So that was how that ended up.
Thank you. I like to say, is it a people process? Is it a people problem or a process problem? It sounds like there was a process in place that you should have been involved, but you weren't.
That's tough to say. It's situational. I mean, as far as I can echo everything positive that's been said about Miranda. Never had an issue with her, never, again, that's why I took it upon myself to have the discussion with her. I was not told to do so. I felt that she deserved that in that situation. So, but unfortunately, this situation is the uniqueness of it and the way it was handled. I don't know. It's hard. I can't give you an answer on that, unfortunately.
Commissioners, if I could, one of the things that I think everybody needs to understand is that under your charter, the manager is bestowed the authority to hire everyone and fire everyone, with the exception of charter commission direct appointee folks like the clerk. And so, and then the charter says that the manager can delegate that authority down if he or she so desires. So in this case that occurred in history that you all are talking about, there may have been a process that everybody thought was a process, but under your charter, the manager always possessed the authority to reach down and fire someone below. The model that I'm wanting to move you guys to in the personnel policy process, but it may also, if you open up the charter, it may require maybe help by changing the charter. I feel like in most of the best organizations, at least the public entities that I've worked with, the top person, be it the city manager or the county administrator, directly terminates his or her leadership crew, so deputy administrators and department heads. The department heads then have delegated termination and hiring authority for folks below them. And one of the things that allows for is that the manager or the administrator cannot possibly be aware of everything that goes on in every department and how everybody's performing and what their attitude has been like or whatnot. So they're a more poor judge of should someone be fired versus suspended for 5 days versus just counseled. The department heads get to know their people best. And so the model that I would hope that we could eventually get to here in Madeira Beach is that kind of a model. One of the things that model allows for, and this is, we'll be getting to this topic number 2 when we're done with this topic, but I also am encouraging the city to move to a model where the leadership team, which is department heads and above, are exempt from the civil service system, that they do serve at the will and pleasure of the manager. And we'll talk about that when we get to it, but keep that in the back of your head. So under this model that I'm talking about, if an employee, a lower-level employee, is suspended or terminated, one of the first due process steps that they could get is to go to the manager, because their department head is who fired them or disciplined them. And so they would have a right, as a first stop, to say, hey, city manager, I don't think my department head, treated me right. Let me show you these comparators who did the same thing and didn't get fired or whatnot. And it provides that manager an opportunity to fix a problem, which may just be making sure that his or her director understands the manager's discipline philosophy. Because different managers, as you all know, they come in with their own philosophies. When I was with Manatee County, it's obviously a much larger organization, and the department heads, some of them were as different as night and day. We had the guy who was in charge of community services, and he was the touchy-feely guy who went to Woodstock. And you could shoot the manager, and he'd still want to hear why you shouldn't be fired, because maybe, And then you had the public works director, who was like, you're out of here. Well, what did I do? Well, you showed up 5 minutes late to work. So, but those directors knew the cultures of the folks that work for them, and what was the best motivators for them, and whether harder, more strict management was the best result, or more soft people person result. And that worked. Every department kind of had its flow. But the county administrator always had that first crack if someone got fired or 5 days suspended, to say, I'm going to take a look at this as that director's boss, and I'm going to make sure I'm comfortable with it. And then if the administrator signed off on it, then that employee had a due process opportunity. In Manatee County's case, they would go to a hearing officer who was assigned to the case, and that hearing officer would conduct quasi-judicial hearing and render his or her recommendation. So all that to say that with this discussion of this prior case, which again, I don't want to get too much into, because that person still exists on the face of this earth, and I don't want her, she doesn't deserve to be getting in the newspaper and all that. So, but I think that what happened then, it was clearly, from everything I've heard from the civil service commissioners, especially Mr. Tilka, who's told me all about it, was horrifying management at its best, or at its worst. That never should have happened. None of it should have happened. I don't know that necessarily drives what you do here today. I just think you all need to hear what are the options that we have in terms of models to move forward, keep it as it is, amend the charter to have the Civil Service Commission be able to overturn, so that we can move forward.
Mr. Ashenfelder, just from, I try to bring it down to a very practical situation. First of all, I hold Mr. Gomez as, he's the pillar of integrity, so I'm not suggesting that this would happen, okay? But what would happen if the exact same thing happened and an employee of Mr. Hatch said something off the record about Mr. Gomez, and Mr. Gomez made sure that that person was fired? Could that happen right now?
Yes, it could. Your charter provides that the manager has the complete authority to terminate any non-charter employee.
So you're suggesting that with implementation of an intervention such as the Civil Service Committee to hear the case, that we could have a buffer at least one place for that employee to go before the decision was made final. Am I understanding that correctly?
So right now, their only recourse is to ask for a Civil Service Commission hearing, but the Civil Service, under your charter, the Civil Service Commission is only advisory. So it would need to be given authority to actually overturn a termination decision.
And who do they advise to?
The manager.
So the person who fired the employee?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's, as I've heard the story.
And again, I don't suggest that would happen with our current city staff, but just that, I'm trying to understand why we'd have to make a change. It seems like it could happen again with the wrong people in place.
Sure, and as I've heard the story, one of the things that was a weakness is that it was a recommendation just to the manager and not to the commission, because you all hire the manager. And so it does seem odd that, at least in the sense that where the manager was the decision maker, that the recommendation goes to the manager, because obviously that person is going to have a strong bias towards upholding his own decision,
So are we making a recommendation or a discussion that the Civil Service Committee could only, could make the decision by themselves, or that they could advise the city manager? Or are we suggesting that perhaps they could advise the board commissioners as well? Or do we have options?
You have plenty of options. You're the governing board. A majority of the Civil Service Commission, correct me if I'm wrong, my commissioners, voted that they felt that they wanted to ask that the charter be changed so that the Civil Service Commission could have authority to overturn a termination decision. It was discussed of this issue that their recommendations don't go to you, and they probably should go to you, but no vote was taken on that. That's an option that you could do to say, and you could do that through your code, to say that recommendations on terminations go to the commission.
But currently, Civil Service can't even hear it. Is that right?
No, they can, yeah, they could hear it, but their recommendation is non-binding.
Only goes, I got you.
And it goes back to the manager. And so the only downfall there, as you all think through your options about it coming to you, is I very much do not want the governing board getting in charge, involved in individual personnel decisions. I like to keep you are the policy setters and so forth. So if we're going to have a body that reviews a disciplinary decision, I think that either needs to be Civil Service Commission or a hearing officer.
Would the complainant have the option of bringing representation, or?
Yes, it's a due process hearing, and so they're entitled
So
to
it wouldn't just
counsel.
be 5 people make an opinion without just listening? They could have representation, it would be a regular hearing.
Well, right, I think, I'm not sure back at the time, Mr. Tilka would know whether you all had your own legal counsel, but you know, if I'm sitting with Civil Service Commission and I'm seeing them going in a direction that is not supported by the evidence or whatnot, I will try as hard as I can to tell them, guys, you know, that you really need to make this decision based upon the evidence. It's a quasi-judicial hearing,
Right.
just like you guys
Right.
are used to with land use. And you can't just insert your view that I don't think that the policy is right, or I don't think that this manager is a good manager. But again, it gets down to, was there just cause? And you know, let's talk about this, the employee says something. If this was a lower level support staff person, that's the historical person, that's more leeway should have been given. But if it is a department head, and that department head is verbally trashing his or her manager, I think if I were the city manager, you're a part of my team, my leadership team. I can't have that. I'm sorry, we're going to have to part ways. And that's and again, I keep getting back to issue 2, which we haven't gotten to yet. But I think if you do provide this extra layer of appeal, a line should be drawn at department heads and above,
Yeah.
because they're the leadership team.
Understood. I feel like the only way to truly understand it is to bring it to the present. Could it happen again? And it sounds like it could.
I have a question. Our fire department firefighters, they're unionized. Okay, say a firefighter gets in trouble. What is their due process for grievance? And then is it similar to what we have with our non-unionized employees?
No, almost all the unions will have arbitration built into their process. And so they have a process where they say, I think I've been wrongfully fired, and it would, you know, go through the management chain, and ultimately, if the relief isn't given, they invoke the arbitration clause, and a neutral arbitrator is picked. There's 5 names, and then union strikes one, management strikes one, and you end up with whoever's left standing. That's your arbitrator, and they come in and they hear it, and they render an order.
Okay, so they also they have their own independent board of people that can make recommendations, whereas right now, we have the Civil Service Commission with no teeth, in essence.
Correct. Yes.
But just to add, those recommendations do go back to the fire management and to the city manager. So it's essentially, it's a very similar process.
Okay.
No, so doesn't Florida have the right to work state?
Yes, Florida has a right to work state. It means that you could be hired or fired, or that you can quit or be fired for a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all, as long as that reason's not illegal.
So I have a question. Chair Embler had stated that she believed that with the policy handbook that they are working on now, once that was in place, this situation would be pretty much resolved. Would not happen. There'd be a lot more things in place. So would it be possible to allow the Civil Service Commission some leeway without changing our charter? I understand having the city manager in charge of firing and hiring directors and then allowing the directors to govern their own people. And I think that in most cases, that would be what happened. I remember when this happened. And so what I've heard today isn't the whole story. Not over the, I mean, it may have been the story in the beginning, but not as it drug on and became more people involved and what have you. I also think that if you were given a situation hypothetically where a city manager just went out and fired somebody because they didn't like something they said, our town is small enough that it's surprising to me it would have never made it to this body, that this body would not have said what's going on, even whether it was individual. And I know that when this started at the time, it was a different city manager. It was a different style of managing. So I guess my question is would we be able to implement the new policy handbook, giving the Civil Service Commission a little bit more oversight without changing our city charter?
So I guess the best answer there is it would depend if anyone ever had legal standing to challenge your doing it that way. And let me elaborate what I mean. So under your charter, it calls out, when it talks about the Civil Service Commission, that it prepares personnel rules. When concurred by the city manager, the rules shall be presented to the Board of Commissioners. And then further down, it says, grievance procedures, including procedures for the hearing of grievances by the Civil Service Commission, which may render advisory opinions based on its findings to the city manager with a copy to the aggrieved employee. So legally, what would be argued by someone who had standing to make the argument is the voters told you what it wanted its civil service board to be, and that was advisory. And that dovetails with the section of the charter that says the manager has the absolute authority to hire and fire. What I would then argue as a good lawyer is, well, but then if you look at the charter, it says down in the next subsection D, duties and powers of the Civil Service Commission. All duties, powers, reservations of power, and funding for the Civil Service Commission may be provided for by ordinance duly passed to the Board of Commissioners of the City of Madeira Beach. So you could do an ordinance, and you could say, you have the power to override the city manager. You are now no longer advisory with respect to termination decisions. And that ordinance would live on the books, and it would be facially valid, and everybody would follow it. I'm simply telling you as a lawyer that if anyone ever did say, but your charter, which is, as we all know, outrules an ordinance, doesn't say that. Your charter says they are advisory. Who knows what a judge would say? I know that's not the clear answer that you wanted, but yes, you can do it by ordinance, and then we'll just cross our fingers and see if anybody challenges.
Well, we don't want to do that.
You know, first, I like the idea of a hearing officer because it gets it out of y'all's hands, and it's as impartial as you can be. This says it's on, but can y'all hear me? Okay.
And the beauty of a hearing officer is that because that's not addressed in the charter, you could just do it by ordinance. And then you could be like Clearwater, and then the Civil Service Commission could review that, and they would be advising, but they'd have a written quasi-judicial order to advise on.
So, and I don't foresee this thing happening with our current city manager, and hopefully he will be here for years to come. But in the event we ended up with another city manager that just pretty much ran roughshod and did whatever he wanted. That was a terrible experience that we as residents trying to do public service to help the city, the Civil Service Commission was walked on. And that's what I don't want to see happen again, nor the employees when they don't really deserve. We've got progressive discipline in place. Now, if that needs to be tweaked, that's great, but there was nothing followed on this at all.
If I might, I would agree with our city attorney and with John with the grievance officer, but I wanted to interject. Is it possible, or is it recommended, or just to put out as a discussion point, would the grievance initially be filed or brought to the Civil Service Commission to look at and investigate, and then take it to the grievance officer? If they see justification, if they automatically say the city manager or the director or whatever was well within their rights for termination, they would stop there. However, if there's some gray area, they could make a recommendation, because there is, not that there's a huge expense, but there's an expense and there's time. And the second part of that question is, you take it to a grievance officer and he agrees with the employee that it was a wrongful termination. Where does it go from there? Is it brought to the board at that point? Is it brought to the city manager at that point? Is it?
I think that I would write the ordinance that the hearing officer would render his or her findings of fact and conclusions of law, and whether the employee should be reinstated or not. The Civil Service Commission would review that, and if the Civil Service Commission did not recommend overturning it, that it would become final. And that still keeps the Civil Service Commission as advising, because they're not themselves making a decision, but it also allows the outcome of the order to just take effect and to get that person reinstated, because the hearing officer ruled that way and the Civil Service Commission agreed with that. If the Civil Service Commission disagrees with it, because they're advisory, they couldn't overrule it, but then you could write the ordinance to say it's then escalated to the commission, and then you guys would have to get involved, which I don't want you to be involved, but
That's why I was bringing it in that reverse order. Civil Service Commission look at it first and then decide.
And here's one of the things there to keep in mind is, I hear you about the expense, but we don't fire that many people, so I don't think, in terms of paying a hearing officer to come, it's not going to be a weekly event. But thinking about it from the employee's perspective, especially if they go get legal counsel, now you're requiring them to bring their legal counsel and pay their legal counsel to present to the Civil Service Commission, which doesn't have power to do anything, only for the Civil Service Commission to say, yeah, I think there's reason enough to go to the hearing officer, and now that same lawyer has to be paid to put the case back on twice with the hearing officer.
Which is typically more expeditious
Hearing
to hearing officer.
Because you don't have to get a quorum, it's a working attorney, so they could fit you into
Okay,
their schedule.
that makes a lot of sense. Now, once that decision is written, what if the employee does not want to be reinstated, but just wants to sue for wrongful termination, and puts a lot of cloud in their reason for suit? So are we helping that, and does it matter?
So first of all, just so we keep our terminology straight, as Commissioner Price rightly pointed out, Florida does not recognize the tort of wrongful termination.
Okay.
So if we give this due process to our employees, the issue is there or is there not just cause? And one of the things that I would insert into this process, if we did some version of this process, is and I did this in the draft ordinance that I did a long time ago that hasn't come to you yet, that the Civil Service Commission or the hearing officer does not have the authority to rule on matters such as Title VII discrimination, Americans with Disabilities Act. That's for the judges to do. The question is, was there or was there not just cause? Now, that employee may say, but I was fired because I was a woman. And the answer there is, if just cause is shown, and you still think, but it was because the real reason is because I was a woman, you got to go to court and do that. And in terms of helping or hurting the city, for sure, there have been times when a hearing officer or a civil service board has rendered a written order that, and then litigation ensues, that has hurt my client. There are other times, and more times than not, I think, where because the process is good and everybody does what they're supposed to do and the evidence is what it is, that it helps my client. So it's a mixed bag, but I wouldn't take the fear of hurting the city in a lawsuit to make your decision of whether you do this or not, because at least as long as I'm on the scene, I've been doing labor and employment law since 1996, I would not let Mr. Gomez or anybody else get down that road that far, and if it wasn't a good case, you know, like I would pull the manager aside and say, look, I just heard the evidence you heard. Let me share my experience with you. This isn't going to go well, you know, for you, so you need to pull that employee aside and that attorney, and let's work out a settlement agreement. That's how that would go. But if management does what it should be doing in terms of progressive discipline, documenting, being consistent in the application of the rules, it shouldn't be a problem.
I would have to wonder why exactly what you're saying, Attorney Eschenfelder, didn't happen with that one incident. Why didn't the city, I don't know who that was at that time, get a hold of the city manager and say, hey, this is what I know, X, Y, Z, and let's stop this? But
As best I
guess we'll never
could
know.
piece together, and of course the folks that were here at the time, you know, probably know more detail than I do, is you had a manager who was ruling through fear, a lot of people were afraid, but you also didn't have the employment law counsel that you had at the time wasn't engaged, didn't feel empowered to be engaged, had to be called over from Tampa. And so I think that the process that the package that I would want to put before you of both the personnel policies and the accompanying ordinance that we would do to change the code would make sure that the Civil Service Commission would have independent legal counsel, that I'm there. And I talked to them about this last time. I'm like, you know, if there ever is a prosecution in front of you, if the city gives you this authority, there would be a different lawyer presenting management's case, and then I would be sitting with you, making sure that you understood the law. When I asked, and you guys can pipe in, there just wasn't legal counsel there to say, management, this is bad, you shouldn't do it. And that's important because who calls that lawyer? Management. And so if management didn't want the lawyer involved, he just wouldn't have been invited.
Thank you. I would like to hear from each one of the commission members, which... Go. Okay.
It says it's on. In that situation where we had a Civil Service Commission and hearing and the city manager completely ignored the process, wouldn't show up, wouldn't give his side of the story, things of that nature, is that some teeth that we can give to the civil service folks that they can require the manager or the decision maker to
Even
show
there,
up?
when I heard, you know, all this story from the folks who were there, you look at your current charter, and your current charter says, in describing the powers of the Civil Service Commission, shall have the power to issue subpoenas to compel attendance by witnesses to administer oaths. So, and that was in place at the time this all went down. Nobody apparently told the commissioners that they had that authority. Am I correct, Commissioner?
Attorney? Yes, as I recall, we had an attorney for the Civil Service Commission. I think maybe the city attorney was present. I'm not sure if he remembers that. And then...
I was not the city attorney at the time.
No, okay.
Okay.
But we had
Let's make that
multiple,
clear.
multiple attorneys. I'll have to say that, at least three.
But did you guys at the time say, can I subpoena someone?
I don't know, to be honest with you. If our chair attempted to, write a subpoena, but we attempted it with letters, I'm sure. So I don't know what
Anyway,
constitutes
to
it.
answer your question, the power's already there.
Just, so it sounds to me like Mr. Eschenfelder, a viable alternative to changing the charter would be to create an ordinance that required a hearing official, so that the Civil Service Commission could give an informed advice that could stand up if it got that far.
And if you say that if the Civil Service Commission concurred in that recommended order, that it would become final and binding. And then that would get you somebody who could actually overrule the manager's decision without
But
needing to change the charter.
the ordinance would require a hearing official, a lawyer, someone there.
Yeah, a hearing officer of some type.
Hearing officer.
So I personally like the idea of the hearing officer. I hear Happy when she says, you've got 5 people appointed that you're going to allow to make decisions, and they're not elected. I like the idea of the hearing officer because it is someone totally removed to make a informed decision based on the facts, outside of passing a revision to our charter, taking the road of going with a hearing officer that then gives empowered information to the Civil Service Commission. And at the same time, I would hope that our body of government here would continue to be paying attention, because in this case, when the city manager did not do his job, the commission at that time should have called him to the floor for that. I mean, that is our job. So if the city manager's not doing his job, he works for us. To not bring that up and make that a real point of issue, I think is just the city commission not performing their duties. That's my opinion.
I would like to hear a comment from each member of the CSC. Are you okay or not okay with this hearing officer concept?
Well, I just want to say I do agree with Chair Embler that we have worked very hard on the new manual, and we are going to have much better procedures in place. But the issue that we're talking about here is, even back then, the procedures weren't followed, and so we really do need something new so that there is some teeth. We'll just keep coming back to that word. I think that the hearing officer, if Attorney Eschenfelder thinks that we could draft an ordinance such as this, where there is this impartial, professional hearing officer that then issues a decision that would come to the Civil Service Commission, who would then review it and potentially implement it. I think that is a great way to go, because we don't have to worry about changing the charter over it, but we still have that important buffer for city employees.
Okay. Paul?
I also like the idea of a hearing officer. I think they're definitely more qualified and what have you than we would be as a collective body. And then for it to come back before us, and we do what we need to do with, the decision. I think it's very smart just to do that without attempting to get a referendum and put that together. We can put something together nicely. Mr. Elchenfelder felt like there might be a problem at a certain point, but I think we can live with that.
I also support the idea of having a separate hearing officer. I think that's a great way to go. It takes away any potential bias of a committee that's not elected, and I totally support that. And thank you for bringing that option forward, Rob.
And I agree with the rest of the committee, too. I think it's an excellent way to go. One other thing I'd like to add in there. Mr. Eschenfelder wrote that inside of the charter, it states that we're advisory body, and we provide our findings in a grievance, which we're going to be calling appeal. We provide that to the city manager and the aggrieved person, whoever filed that. in our rules, we're also writing it that it will come to the Board of Commissioners as well. So we're including an additional step. We're going to do what the charter says, but we're adding an additional step into it to be certain you're not overlooked.
I also agree with that as far as the hearing officer goes.
I'd like to bring up one other thing that we've recently implemented, and that is at each of our meetings, we ask an HR representative to report out to us anything and everything that's going on personnel related. So we discuss openings. We also discuss, are there, what are any disciplinary actions and what steps are there, so that we're trying to be proactive and not blindsided, but rather asking it to be much more transparent at our level.
Any other questions from any of the commissioners?
You keep referring to the human resources people. Well, that is the city manager currently. I know earlier, and I think John pointed out, part of your escalation process was to bring it, I think the second escalation was to human resources, which is the city manager.
Just to correct, the HR function for that is Megan Powers.
Okay. Which reports
Which is
directly to the city manager.
Well, the HR director would report directly to me.
That's true.
Yeah.
My second question is, I don't know that we've addressed what the next step is. What is the enforcement piece of it? Where does it go after a decision's been made by the grievance officer?
Well, again, so I would write the ordinance to say that that goes to the Civil Service Commission. If the Civil Service Commission concurs, it becomes final. So it is an enforceable order against the manager. That's where it goes.
Okay.
Can I ask, would that only be to reinstate, nothing else? I don't think the commission should be asking for anything other than reinstatement through that process.
So legally speaking, of course, Commissioner Price knows this, if you are reinstated and you have lost back pay, then to be made whole, you're going to have to get your back pay for whatever it was when you were wrongfully put out. But the hearing officer would be including that in his or her award. You guys would just be concurring in the award. Does that answer your question?
Would the hearing officer be able to modify that direction? Say the person really did need to be counseled, maybe suspended. Would that be an opportunity that the city manager could take advantage of? Because we don't want to limit the city manager's possibilities of managing the city. We just know that if there's a problem like it's been in the past, we need ability to be able to say, hey, you can't do that. That's all. We don't want to prevent the city manager from doing that job. There's other things that could be done. So I just want to make sure that's not overlooked.
Yeah, no, the manager, the manager would have to be bound by the ruling of the hearing officer, assuming the CSC blesses that ruling. And so whatever is ordered by that hearing officer, so it could be just reinstatement because I find no just cause. But it also could be, and civil service boards do this too, we find that there was just cause to discipline, but we also find that termination is not supported because they have shown 3 other cases in the past 2 years where the same conduct only resulted in a 2-day suspension, so 2-day suspension is imposed instead. So the hearing officer could do that, and that's really a better outcome because it doesn't let the employee get off the hook. It's not either reinstatement or you're fired. It's maybe you really did do something that violated the rules. It just didn't warrant termination. What should that discipline be? The hearing officer would make that recommendation to you guys as well.
Just a general question of curiosity. For any employee that's terminated, is there any downside on not going through this process automatically?
So the only downside is that any claim that you may want to have as to you were denied due process and terminated without just cause would be waived, because if the employer provides a procedure for you to use and you don't use that procedure, you can't make that legal argument in court. you can still say, I was fired because of my race or whatever, sure, but there's a whole, you would be kind of giving up yet another count in your lawsuit if you didn't, at least try to go through the process.
Any other questions or comments? All right, let's move on to the next item then, letter B. At the September 13th, 2023 Civil Service Commission meeting, they voted on whether directors are civil service protected. The motion carried 2-1.
So when we brought this up in the Civil Service Commission meeting, this was actually the majority of the group agreed to bring it forward and ask for guidance. We haven't decided should there be a director that could be reinstated or that first line manager that reports directly to the city manager. We haven't decided that. We know that we have got to work through, okay, what is it going to be? But we also know that if we come up with the wrong decision, we give it to you, we've got to rewrite it. And we felt as long as we're in front of you, we'll ask you for guidance on it so we get it right the first time and don't have to go back and rewrite the policy, all right? And I can tell you that I do have a side of this that I strongly lean towards, and I'm trying to keep it open, so if you hear me be biased, I'm not trying to be. I'm really trying to make sure both sides are heard on this, all right? One of the things that was mentioned in the August 2018 joint CSC and Charter Review Committee is that arbitration steps need to be put in place so that all employees should have a due process in the event that an employee was terminated. That's in, I gave you the page for that. What we're asking here, because the CSC is here to clarify the other issue, we want to know what is your thought process on this. There are two tracks, all right? That director, that high-level manager in Madeira Beach for that, and if this person should be able to file a grievance or appeal for that wrongful, which I guess that's not good terminology in Florida, and I had no idea, but for not having a due process termination. Is that the correct way? Okay, all right, for due process termination. All right, so one is they're at-will employees. They can be let go or leave themselves for any reason, no reason, or bad reasons. It doesn't matter. They can be let go. All right, and the other is that they would have the ability to file appeal because they didn't get due process. That's the two, all right? The first one, say what? Okay, all right. The first one, the director should be an at-will employee and serving at the discretion of the city manager. So the city manager needs the ability to remove directors if they are creating conflicting direction from how the city manager wants to run the Madeira Beach. I mean, he needs that ability. That person that's in that position needs that ability. There should be no tolerance for distracting from the direction that the city manager is providing in the oversight of the city. So if that person makes a mistake, gone, all right? That's the thought there, all right? And there doesn't have to be a reason, all right? The other is that the director should be able to file an appeal through the CSC for due process, not having due process for what is it called, being at fault or something like that? I don't know what you call it, but due process for being terminated. Is that correct words? What do you call it when a person, just cause?
Just cause,
That's it,
yeah.
thank you, just cause. All right. Hey, I even put it in quotations there. There we go. Okay. So the city manager needs to show cause to terminate an employee. However, the city manager should be able to move quickly to remove a director that does not conform to the plans in effectively managing the city. Again, whichever way this goes, there should be no tolerance for distracting from the direction that the city manager is providing in the oversight of the city. The city manager needs latitude in those respects. You don't want someone at that level pushing stuff down and causing all sorts of disruption. That is a huge problem, all right? Those are really the two, and I have thoughts that I want to share, but I'm going to wait, okay? So should the director positions be considered as having the ability to file an appeal if they do not have just cause for being terminated? That's the words that should be there. Would you like to say something before I say anything? Anything else I say beyond this, guys, is my own opinion, is my thoughts, okay? It's not something the committee asked me to say or anything of that sort. Is that all right? Okay. So what I want to share here is, and this comes to me from long lines, being in the military, things of that sort. You have your leaders, that are up above, and everybody should follow the leader. The person that's at the top, that's the one that's setting the cadence. What's going to happen within the organization, that person sets it, all right? And those people that report directly to them, there should be an expectation that they fall in line with that, all right? The only problem I see with me personally, if a director says, I don't like what you're doing, you're gone, all right? Without having the just cause process, without that, is that say something happens and Mr. Gomez, because he's a great guy, is offered to work for the governor of the state of Florida, and he says, yes, I'm going to take that job because it pays $1 gazillion, all right? And it'd be really cool to do. But so say he does that. We have a new city manager come in. The new city manager, for whatever reason, doesn't like one of these directors that reports directly to them. You're gone. There's a problem there. The esprit de corps that's established with people who have been in positions of longevity, a lot of our directors, as people who report to the city manager, have worked their way up through the ranks. They understand the historical perspective of the city, things that have happened, things that should and should not happen. They can communicate that effectively to the city manager, and hopefully are following the city manager's lead and communicating it back down to the troops or the employees, whatever you want to call it. If you get rid of those first two rungs of leadership, you will have chaos. That, to me, is a concern. I'm not saying that the city manager should not be able to terminate a first-line manager, because honestly, if that first-line manager is making his job impossible, get rid of the person, cut him out. But there needs to be just cause, not any reason whatsoever at all. That's my only concern in that. That's all I can say.
So are you suggesting that, God forbid, Mr. Gomez goes somewhere else, we hire another city manager who doesn't like the directors we have, that they could just fire them?
Yes.
We've had that happen.
Yeah.
Without giving any explanation? Is that the way it is?
We
Yes,
have had that
yes,
happen. Yeah.
Yes, that's the way it is. And I guess the
Important who you hire.
You know, Commissioner Cantrell and I have had a good conversation about this, and the whole Civil Service Commission has. And I guess the counter argument to everybody should be treated fairly is that, and again, I'm speaking from my experience, seeing these things actually happen. You can have a member of the management team who is at odds with the leader, either because something changed between them or because it's a new leader that comes in, you know, our manager leaves and our manager comes in. And I've seen it with my own eyes play out over a series of months where that manager or that director does everything in his or her power to undermine the CEO, trash talking in the community, but keeping the fingers off, you know, and so it's hard for the CEO to be able to prove specific things that the person did that matches the discipline rules in the discipline section. It's more that the senior level manager is saying, I'm not on your team, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you don't succeed. And maybe it's because I want to be the next manager, you know, and so if I could get you out of here, there's just a lot of opportunity for undermining the manager. And then on the flip side, I don't know all of your backgrounds, but you know, if you've been a senior manager and you come into a new organization, there is a certain amount of cachet to the argument that I should be able to pick my own management team. And to be sure, when you come in, like when I took over as chief assistant county attorney, I didn't advocate to fire my group. I got to work with them, but it then becomes obvious who's a good, productive person, who's going to come into my, you know, because the prior manager had his or her view, I now have my view. So can you adapt to that? Can you become part of my team? And sometimes it just doesn't work out for whatever reason. And so my argument to you, to sort of the counter to Commissioner Cantrell, is that if you saddle your top manager with his or her core leadership team, who feels free to be at odds with the manager, because as long as they don't do something that violates paragraph 4, section 2, you know, such that progressive discipline can be done, I can mess with that manager for the next 10 years. is that something you want them to live with? That's the tension between the two.
Well, right away, what pops into my head is, again, what if we created an ordinance or a rule that a new city manager had to work with the current set of directors for X number of months before they could change or fire or terminate, give them the opportunity to see, oh, that person doesn't seem to be qualified, but actually they know the job very well. Is that even a possibility?
It is. All I would say is that I would say can't be fired without cause. I mean,
Sorry, without
obviously,
cause.
if they
For-
shoot somebody.
So maybe the first 6 months, no firing for the first 6 months or something
Correct.
like that, without just cause.
Couldn't you put that in the employment contract?
So my advice to my clients always is that you have contracts with only two people, your attorney and your manager. Everybody else is an employee who follows the personnel policy and who gets a conditional offer of employment saying, here's your initial wage, here's our lovely employment benefits. Otherwise, your terms and conditions are set forth in the personnel policy. So you'd put it in the ordinance, and I'll be doing an ordinance on this other stuff. So if you want to add that provision, that's actually quite an
So
inventive.
that's another ordinance? Or part of?
It's another section in the ordinance I'm doing.
I got you.
Yeah.
I got you.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here a second. I thought Robin was still in here. I think it would be great to get some input from Robin, but I hope we don't go down a path of micromanaging our city manager. He does need the ability to take care of his directors, or if they're not directing, he needs the ability to let them go, and that's just my 2 cents worth on it.
So I tend to agree with that. I think that when you're hiring a city manager, you're hiring, and we've been through city managers that were not good for the city, that did come in and just got rid of people because of whatever reason. However, it was a different commission, and this commission is going to change over time, and that, if Robin ever does decide to leave, there'll be another city manager chosen. But regardless, I think that you have to allow the city manager to choose his team. When any body of government changes over, the staff that that reports directly to them often changes completely. Not that I would like that, because I personally really like the employees who have worked for the city and have years of knowledge. Mr. Trask is a perfect example, in my opinion, of someone who can sit here and speak to the history of our city. When Megan comes to the meetings and she speaks to the history of public works, to see her go would be terrible. However, I do think that when you have good employees and you hire the right city manager, then you have employees who are going to want to work with the city manager for the better of the city. So although I appreciate what Mr. Cantrell is saying, I would not necessarily be in opinion, or in the opinion that we should tie the city manager's hands. Again, that would be something that if the city manager just started firing people left and right, we as a commission, whomever that commission is, should be paying attention and asking those questions.
So then you're suggesting that, say somebody came in, we hired a city manager, and he fired everybody and started over, then we would have to go through the process of deciding whether or not we approved. Because we can recommend, we can change our city manager, but that would be a whole nother process.
I mean, hiring a city manager is
Not easy.
not easy. And here's what I reflect back on. There was a time in Madeira Beach that we went through where the city was extremely divided. And we got a new commission, and when that commission came in, there were a lot of people who had worked for the city for years who were let go. Through whatever avenues, reasons, there was a big changeover in the city. Regardless of what your politics were for the people that were sitting up here, getting rid of all of the people that they got rid of just because they had worked for somebody, it was wrong. And what I would say is, I would hope that we've grown from that and would not have a body of people sitting here who would be supportive of hiring someone who would just upend the whole city. That we would look for, in the event that we had to hire a new city manager, I would hope that the five of us would be looking for a candidate that would want to be similar to Robin. You would want to hire somebody. I mean, it's a long interview process. You know, we get a lot of information that we would be looking for an individual that was managing, that wanted to come in and take the city from where it is. The city's in a good place. We have a good manager, we have a good staff, and that we would be looking to fill that position for someone who would just continue to move the city in a positive way, is what I'm saying. So then to hire that person in and just say, for instance, we hired in a new city manager and one of the department heads just didn't like him or her, whatever it was, a boy or girl, or man or woman, doesn't like them and decides, you know what, I don't like them. I've been here for 20 years, I don't like them, and I don't care what they do, I am going to be against them. Well, that person doesn't belong here then, even if they'd been here 20 years. But if the city manager comes in and says, well, I don't like it because you don't have any hair, so you got to go. I don't like you, I just don't like you. That's not also what you want, right? You want, so I think you have to let the city manager go.
Naturally, I agree with you
manage.
with hiring,
Yeah.
with hiring commissioner. I just feel like you're more optimistic than I am. City managers change, as we all know, boards change, as we've seen. And I personally think that an ordinance with 6 months, just 6 months buffer, you got to have just cause for 6 months. Give the new employee and the new city manager an opportunity to see if they really hate each other before that time comes. At the end of 6 months, if that employee, that director has caused nothing but pain, just shredded on the edges, you know, without any just cause, after 6 months, if you need to get rid of him, get rid of him. But I'm suggesting that no changes for 6 months.
I agree. I think that's a great idea. I would also like to add, there's a saying that the best predictor of future behavior is taking a look at past behavior. I've not observed how the interviewing process goes, but I think it's incumbent upon you folks that when Robin wins the lottery and leaves us, there are ways and good questions to ask. So you determine what is their leadership style, and is it going to complement what we want? You know, tell me about a time when you took on a new job, what management structures what personnel changes did you make? And then sit back and listen. And is this person, you know, with your questions about what they've done in the past, are they going to fit with your vision for what we want in the community? So yeah, I know you've got a hard job, but there's a concept called behavioral interviewing that will help you get to the point where you know this person's leadership style.
This board would do that.
Yeah, correct. I would like to
But
hear
what about
Robin's
5 years
opinion.
from now?
Well, that's why we also do your 6 month rule. I like that, David.
Sorry.
I think 6 months is too long. There's a lot of damage that can be done. But you're gonna know within 3 months, in my opinion. And honestly, those managers come in, they know, those directors know everything about the city. They don't know.
3 months.
People at that level don't come in with the idea of fire. They come in with the idea of work with everyone who's there. In general, right? I mean,
In a perfect world. We can talk about the amount of time. I just dislike the idea that it's a different board who doesn't get along. I think we get along pretty well.
We get along.
We like our city manager. We maybe something happens, he has to leave. We get somebody we don't know that well, and suddenly, I'm sorry, I have to go right to our current personnel. I would be heartbroken if some of our current staff was let go, because we have a wonderful staff. And I would hate to see that happen just because the new guy, who we didn't agree on, but we had to have somebody, just wanted to clean house. I mean, 3, 6, just not walk in and get rid of everybody.
I'd like to hear what Robin thinks. I would really like his opinion on what he I do think 6 months is too long.
Can you go grab him for us, Megan? Okay.
I think putting a number on it is probably a good thing, but it'd be interesting to know what his thoughts are on that from his history and experience.
Yeah, and I'd like to get some views from the residents here in Madeira Beach, email, call, to find out what they think. I think it's a great idea, 3 to 6 months, but also, let's hear what they have to say also.
Go ahead, Jerry. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mayor.
No, I've got another event to go to. I'm going to have to take off, but I wanted to thank you all for listening to me. I got to run.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very
John.
much.
Jerry, would you like to ask the question of the city manager?
Oh, boy. Mr. Gomez, we're actually talking about when a new city manager takes on the job, all right? Would you feel that there's a period of time that would be realistic the city manager should wait and observe before they make hard decisions to release people without cause? So in other words, if you came in, there was a director there, and they're literally causing you a nightmare, can you move quickly enough to get them out of place and get somebody else in that'll work with you? Or is there a period of time that a city manager should wait to make sure things are okay?
So my process on that is not to come in and make staff changes, and certainly you must wait at least 6 months to a year, other than somebody who is obviously a pain and isn't part of the mission, the vision, but that's part of the role of the commission, as has been stated, who you hire. And I will, of course, I'm biased, I'm going to say the commission that hired me did a great job, and they've done a great job where I've been hired, obviously. However, the questions were exactly that. What are your plans with the staff? That's part of the hiring process. You do not want somebody to come in, fire 2, 3, 4, bring in 2 or 3, 4 from the outside. That causes significant disruption. I have been in an organization that shall remain nameless, but I think you'll figure it out, where that happened a couple of times, and it did create chaos, anxiety. The last thing that I would ever want as a manager is to have the people that have my back, the people that I rely on every day, the department heads, to feel that I'm going to remove them. That's not part of the process. Time has to go by to evaluate, minimum of 6 months, realistically, even up to a year. By then, you really do have a very good view as to how they're going, their level of knowledge, their expertise, their experience, how they will react. I have no idea how they're going to present at a council commission meeting, even if they come up here once or twice. Sometimes they can be nervous. I got the new boss and I want to impress them. We all make mistakes, so there has to be some time. But I will go back to the due diligence of who is hired, and whether myself or whomever, that's part of the interview process. Or you come in here and make large-scale changes. One organization, I was asked to come in and make some changes of department heads, and I simply stated, I will need 6 months to a year to evaluate that. And when I went through the criteria, that was fine, and fortunately didn't have to make the change, but that's my viewpoint. Unfortunately, again, there are managers and some of my colleagues that believe, as they go from city to city, to bring their own staff. I've never been a fan of that, and that's why some colleagues don't like me, because, well, they hire you, you're the one that's in charge. You oversee personnel. We're all human, and you need to give people a chance to show you, to prove what they can do. And so that I couldn't be happier with the staff that I have here, the department heads. They are wonderful. They do a great job. Hopefully none of this ever happens, but as I will reiterate, we do have the process to go through. I spent 16 years as a city auditor. If I don't follow a process, then I think my younger self from a decade ago will come back and tell me you have to follow that process. That clearly has to happen in personnel matters. Megan Powers is aware of that. The department heads are aware of that. That's how we continue to do that. We have had one instance of disciplining an employee because it was a very high offense that led to a discipline led to a suspension. That's the only one that we've been involved here. Any other personnel issues have been during the probationary period, which we do have, where you can make changes to staff that may not be working out. But again, that's under the probationary, and everybody is made aware of that. We do, again, as our personnel rules stipulate, that is what we follow. Sorry for the longer than you probably wanted to answer.
Mr. Mayor?
6 months, minimum.
What if we were suggesting that we have an ordinance that says for the first 6 months, the new city manager, whoever that would be, would have to have just cause to get rid of a director?
I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't know if the next person that is up here
Well,
would agree to that.
that's really not the question.
Yeah,
We-
no,
we
I'm
wanna
fine,
make that
I'm
decision.
perfectly fine with that, but again, I'm a little bit, I will say that I am different from a lot of my colleagues.
Sure.
I
We
don't.
may not get so lucky next time.
Maybe not, but I think I don't have an issue with that. I'm not aware of any other city that currently does. I don't know if either of you are, but I've not heard of a city that requires or as part of an employment agreement with your manager, your administrator, if that's in the employment agreement. We could ask ICMA and maybe see if they are aware of that, but I'm not aware of any city or county having an ordinance where the new administrator, your new CEO, has to go through a certain process before.
It's not that they can't fire a director, but
Right,
they
you
would
just have to have a cause.
just cause.
You just have to follow the process of disciplinary progressive progress.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I personally like the idea of a 6-month minimum for several reasons. If what Robin's suggesting and Mr. Eschenfelder is suggesting is that it is a mindset for many city managers that they're like an NFL manager, they're going to bring their team with them. That not only would hurt our city, but it would hurt the city that they are leaving. They have to have an opportunity to get to know the staff, the directors, the upper management, and create relationships to see maybe all are good, maybe some work out, maybe there was a dynamite person that they worked with before that they'd like to bring over because someone's not pulling their weight. I don't know, but at least you have a minimum time period to figure that out. What, is 6 months the magic number? I don't know. But the bigger case is what we're talking about is after that period, are they at-will employees and they work and they don't have the civil service protection. And that sounds like what everyone is feeling and everyone is saying. And you have that right to have your team around you.
And again, and one other thing, that is why cities have employment or agreements with your higher levels, starting with your department directors. Some go below that to assistants to department managers, just to further define the roles or responsibilities. It's formalized. Some cities use that for additional benefits. I'm not necessarily advocating that because that causes issues as well, but having agreements, you can have in the agreements what the termination process is. So that is another option. Some cities do use that as well.
You got great thoughts. Thank you. Appreciate
All right,
that.
sure.
Mr. Eschenfelder, does that need to be an ordinance, or are we allowed to write that in the rules to where that if there has to be a 6-month grace period where there has to be just cause, but after 6 months, those employees are at will and they have, even during that just cause period, they have no protections under the appeal process?
Yeah, so Commissioner Cantrell, you're thinking the same thing I am. So the first issue with the hearing officer, we will include that in the ordinance that's going to come to you, because that creates an outside official that needs to be blessed by ordinance. But with respect to the 6-month situation where a new manager can't dismiss an at-will department head for the first 6 months, it would have to be, unless they had just cause, that could be in the personnel policy, and that's the better place for it to live, because if it needs to be changed over time, given experience, it'll be easier to do that, so.
but no civil service protection. I think everybody agrees with that, is that right?
Well, no, I think what you're hearing is that in the first 6 months, if the manager wishes to terminate the department head, he or she would have to show just cause. So they'd effectively be protected by civil service, at least the system, for the first 6 months. And then they become terminable at will after that 6 months. Am I saying that correct? Okay. Okay. Correct. This is upon a new manager coming in, yeah.
Mr. Gomez, is that your intention in that thought process too?
Yes.
It's a bit of a double-edged sword, I guess.
But I just feel like 6 months, you know, try to get along for a bit. We have some good people. And just because your last Parks and Recreation person was amazing, at least get an opportunity to meet our Parks and Recreation person. And then after that, you know.
Well, or the other thing too is, especially this community has suffered so much turnover, you know, there's much to be said for allowing that manager to suck as much institutional knowledge out of that person's head in that 6 months. No, I'm being practical, you know, it's like if you come in and you say, this person is not my parks director, but they've been here 22 years, so I need them to show me what's been going on, even though and who knows, after that 6 months, maybe their assessment may change, and, oh, that's not such a bad parks director.
Right.
Jane?
Yeah, I think as the clock is ticking, and I know you folks have another meeting, unless there's further discussion, I think we've pretty well come to some good conclusions, and that this was very helpful. I hope y'all feel the same way. Jerry, thank you so much for putting together the framework so we could have a good discussion around these points. So I know, Mr. Mayor, this is officially your meeting, but I want to give you permission to close when you want to, so you can get a bit of a break before your next one.
Well, thank you kindly. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Everybody's opinions and comments count. So at this time, it's 5:22. We're going to adjourn the Civil Service Commission and Board of Commissioners meeting. And thank you.